So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Rishi Sunak is privately drafting plans to rebuild Britain's ties with the EU. So Prime Minister Sunak has privately asked senior ministers and officials to draw up plans for rebuilding UK's relationship with the EU after years of acrimony since Brexit. And you can see, this comes off the back of the secret summit where Gove admitted that Brexit is not working and looking at how the UK can rebuild its relationship with the EU. That was one of the points of the summit. Johnson was very antagonistic towards the EU, Truss as well, so this is a change from the Tories here. Sunak, who won the prime ministerial role because of the ERG backing him, this is a bold strategy. The work focuses on defence, migration and so-called economic statecraft, which includes issues such as trade, energy and international standards. Sunak's pivot towards the EU was described by ministers, diplomats and officials who asked not to be named discussing unpublished plans. UK officials are hoping that in the coming days they will be able to announce a solution to the years-long dispute with the EU over the protocol, and Sunak's team are looking to use that breakthrough as the foundation for a more comprehensive improvement in ties with the bloc. And we are still waiting for the full breakthrough on the protocol, as of recording date anyways. With defence, we can talk about that later on in the video. The UK needs more migration. The UK is facing a huge worker shortage across the board, and I don't think making migration easier from the EU is going to really help that, given the fact that EU citizens have the ability to move within the entire bloc, freedom of movement here, to they can work in any state really, whilst to come to the UK they need a visa, pay an NHS surcharge, etc. It's expensive. Economic statecraft does not mean much. Statecraft is more a nerd term, which means how you manage the state's affairs or governmental affairs. So in this case, it would be a change in how the government deals with economic policy, probably in the context of our economic approach to the EU. Nebulous terms like this with little context are not great. The change in the UK strategy towards Europe was not an admission that Brexit has been a failure, a government official insisted, arguing it was a reflection of a changing reality. This is true. Let's not forget that Brexit means different things to different people. Brexiteers like Daniel Hannan wanted to stay in the single market. More recently, he argued it would have been a temporary measure. Seems like something he should have mentioned before the referendum. But now as a third country, you can choose to be antagonistic or cooperative towards the EU. Leaving the EU did not mean we had to be either one, but we had a choice. But the bit about the changing reality is interesting. What specifically has changed their minds? Is it the import checks, the export checks, the really bad worker shortage versus other EU member states? Are there other things that factored into the changing reality? If you know, let me know in the comments. If the impasse on the protocol can be broken, Sunak's administration aims to deliver more tangible policy successes this year. Sunak's team sees his relationship with French President Emmanuel Macron as promising. The era of the short kings is here, and cooperation with France will be essential if the UK is to stop undocumented migrants with channel crossings in small boats. That's one of Sunak's 5 pledges, and if the UK really wanted to reduce the amount of channel crossings, they could set up a processing facility for asylum seekers in France, and also make it so you don't have to be in the UK to claim asylum here, like we did for certain refugees. Even Afghan refugees, the ones that we promised refuge to, are crossing the channel, because that's the only way to claim asylum here for them. Britain is also working on detailed plans to bolster defence ties with Europe. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the EU is likely to welcome closer cooperation on security, since the UK and France have the most powerful militaries in Europe. Indeed, when Sunak's predecessor Johnson was negotiating the terms of Brexit, the EU pushed for more cooperation on defence, but Johnson refused. And in the context of NATO being a bit of a mess, I think at the time, thanks to Donald Trump, it would make sense for the EU to seek further cooperation on this. The government also wants to work more closely with the EU on joint defence exports to deter non-European countries from agreeing contracts with Russia and China that could prove trickier to negotiate. So this makes sense because the UK is a major exporter of weapons, so by working with the EU to export these weapons, it makes sense. The question is, can the UK actually get the parts we need to keep making this stuff? Supply chain problems mean we can't make ministerial cars in the UK. What else would we struggle to make here? The EU won't want to work with us or work with the UK on exports if it adds significant costs to the weapons or delays due to import checks. Britain's economic fortunes since Brexit have been defined by meagre growth and weak trade with the EU. Official data showed the UK's trade deficit with the bloc had widened to a record in the final quarter of 2022. The UK exporting less services and goods to the EU, and also we are importing more goods, so this deficit will continue to grow. The UK is also counting liquid nitrogen gas that is moving through the UK to the EU as a UK export, which makes no sense. but this has made the official numbers look better than they actually are. So that deficit is worse than the official numbers show, and it will keep getting worse as the UK struggles to make and grow things. We have to import more, and that will continue long term. One UK official said they told Sunak that strong trading relations with Europe will be essential for the economic challenges of the future in areas such as emerging technologies and to deal with threats like global supply shocks and China. The Tories are obsessed with the word emerging technology, emerging markets, etc. Outside the Horizon programme, we would struggle in terms of science. No freedom of movement means we struggle, especially in the context of science. The government seem to have no understanding of technology, and their advisors are perhaps the same. The reality is that a more dangerous world, rising authoritarianism and protectionism means there is no choice but to work closely with our allies, the official said. And the irony is the EU are becoming more protectionist. It was one of the reasons why Brexiteers hate the EU so much. But now we, despite leaving the bloc, want to be protected within the bloc, by the bloc that we left. We want our businesses to be included within the protectionism of the EU, and the EU, for the most part, won't do it. The EU acts in the interest of their member states, not for third countries like the UK is. Civil servants are drawing up a supply chains and import strategy that will propose securing supplies of critical goods like minerals from safe countries in the event of future shocks comparable to the pandemic. A semiconductor strategy will outline an approach similar for the supply of chips, and securing imports from the safe countries over key resources is a good move. But when scarcity or reduced supply happens, like Russia cutting off Europe from gas, it pushes the supply price up. So in principle, it's a good idea. The other issue is that some of these resources are found in more authoritarian countries. That can't be helped, and we're going to have to do deals with authoritarian countries to get access to the supplies. Even then, a bloc like the EU or a country like the US can block exports of key resources if they want to in a scarcity scenario. With the semiconductor, setting one up in the UK probably won't make sense. Intel are looking at setting up large-scale projects in the US and the EU, which will be heavily subsidised with large export markets for the chips. For the UK, Intel may be reluctant because they already have big projects set, but they're still AMD and ARM. But AMD are reliant on TSMC, which they're based in Taiwan, to manufacture their own chips, so they probably aren't in a position to set up a semiconductor. But more importantly, any of the export of these chips from the UK will face export barriers, so the markets will be limited. With the UK car manufacturing, continuing to die, setting up such a facility makes little sense unless the subsidies are huge. Like, who would be the market for UK-made CPUs? That's the question. US President Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act has focused minds in London about the risks of Britain being caught in the middle of two large trading powers pursuing protectionist policies. There is no way the UK would be able to compete with the size of the US and the EU in terms of subsidies and obviously size. So it has instead used diplomacy to negotiate protections for British companies from both sides, a person familiar said. Those talks are being led by Business and Trade Secretary Kemi Badenoch and Sunak herself, and Kemi Badenoch recently spoke about some sort of deal we signed with Italy, which we have no details about because that's how the Tories roll. Badenoch also pivoted away from her predecessor Liz Truss's focus on securing crappy trade deals with countries that have been of debatable economic benefit towards boosting exports and investment. So clearly the UK are looking to move towards damage limitation rather than opportunities. This is something that Brexiteers cry about, but clearly Kemi is no longer chasing crappy trade deals anymore. A huge direction change from the Tories here. The EU and the US have no real interest to protect the UK or UK companies, so she's probably going to struggle as these plans are there in part to revive and push US and EU manufacturing and research, respectively. This is about two blocs competing with each other here. The two most powerful economies in the world, really, the EU and the US. And the UK is an afterthought here, focusing on damage limitation because we can't compete with the US or the EU. We're just a small third country caught in the middle of two economic superpowers. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.